If you have never listened to an entire Your Weekend show before, this is the one I really believe you need to hear. On today's program, we have two different but very related topics. And I think for some of you, it just might change your life.
Everybody ready? Ready?
Yeah.
All right, listen.
It's Your Weekend Show.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
With Bob Biermann.
It's great.
To really get today's program started and to make it all make sense to you, I need to, just for a while, take you back to a different time and a different place.
Fairy tales can come true. It can happen to you if you're young at heart. For it's hard, you will find, to be narrow of mind if you're young at heart. You can go to extremes with impossible schemes. You can laugh when your dreams fall apart at the seams. And life gets more exciting with each passing day. And love is either in your heart or on its way. Don't you know that it's worth every treasure on earth to be young at heart? For as rich as you are, it's much better by far to be young at heart. And if you should survive to 105, look at all you'll derive out of being alive. And here is the best part, you have a head start if you are among the very young at heart. And if you should survive to 105, look at all you'll derive out of being alive. And here is the best part, you have a head start if you are among the very young at heart.
What a different way to open today's program with a song from way back when, Frank Sinatra and Young at Heart. And today, in a way, I do feel young at heart. Once again, I want to welcome you to Your Weekend Show. I'm your host, Bob Biermann. And today is a bit of a different radio program. I know this month we are doing a special series of programs. And believe it or not, toward the end of the program, I'll get back a little bit to the topics we started with. But today, I really want you to take some time to listen to this first segment. I want to share with you a very true and very real story. It is a story that is full of difficulty, a story full of hope, broken dreams, and how all this can actually mean something if we want it to be something, if we're willing to put the effort in to see it through. We have to go way back in time for the beginning of this story. And as I said, this is a true story. Once again, I want to remind you, you're listening to Your Weekend Show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. And just so I don't forget to share it, let me share up at the top of the program our website, yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. You can find out more about the program and what we are all about. But today, I want to share from my heart a very true story from a long time ago. Way back in Brooklyn, New York, a young gal was born into a family of two older brothers, and herself being the youngest. They lived in an area known as Bay Ridge, a part of Brooklyn, New York. Now, we're talking a long time ago. We're not talking today. This was a time when everybody on your street knew everybody. This particular area of Brooklyn was primarily made up of people of Norwegian and Swedish descent, with some Germans. Other neighborhoods very close by were German or Italian or other ethnic groups. That's just how Brooklyn was many, many years ago. And so into this household, this young girl is born. And her life starts out wonderfully. Her dad and her mom love their children. But something happened that destroyed everything in their lives. Her mother got sick, and in a short amount of time, when she was very, very young, her mother died. Now, her mother's death was incredibly hard on her dad, and he literally suffered a breakdown. And he was just unable to even care for his two sons and his very, very young daughter. And for a period of time, he placed all three of those children in a place called the Coleman House, which was kind of an orphanage, short-term, sometimes longer-term, but he had no choice. He just could not cope. He could not work. He could not function. He really took the death of his wife so incredibly hard. And so this young girl ends up there for a fairly extended period of time. And as her dad's heart began to heal and they started visiting more, he also had been introduced to a woman who everybody said he should marry, which he did. So eventually all three children came home to a new stepmother in the same house in which they had lived, a brownstone in Brooklyn, New York. It's one of these multi-stories where the semi-basement was actually a little restaurant and tavern, and the upper two floors is where they lived. That was their home in Brooklyn, New York. Life was not as good as it could have been for that little family. The new stepmom was not all that enthralled with this guy's two sons and daughter. The two sons had picked up a few bad habits, shall we say, during their time living at the Coleman House. In fact, they became somewhat, as they would say today, incorrigible. And for a brief period of time, all three were sent back in order for them to try to repair their fairly new marriage. About a year passed, and the older boys were able to one by one emancipate themselves and left the area. One went to work, and a couple of years later, another one went to work, and then they eventually even joined the military. And I'll stop right here to tell you there was a bit of an age difference between the two boys, a substantial age difference between the two boys that were literally back to back, and their much younger sister by a little over 10 years. And so as she is a little girl, she finally gets to come back home without her brothers. They've now moved on in their lives. But it was never for her, quote, a good life or a great life. While it is true that her father did love her she never could win the heart and affection of her stepmom. She never could be quite good enough for her stepmom. When she turned 16, her one brother had been in the service and had come home, and from the service he had joined the United States Marines. And after his tour of duty toward the end of World War II, he ended up in California, a town called 29 Palms, California. And there this young gal wrote a letter to her brother asking if there was any way she could come to visit because she didn't want to end up back in the Coleman house. And the brother said certainly. And so this young lady, with the help of her brother across country, got on a train. And about the time that she was turning 17, left home and headed off to California. Now, her brother had been there for about 7 or 8 years. He was married and beginning his own life, and he actually ran a service station, a gas station, out in 29 Palms. And that's where this young gal arrived. And she worked part-time in some restaurants being a waitress, and she lived with her brother. And for the first time in her life, life began to look good. She was away from the stepmom. She's living with a brother that cares. She is old enough now to begin to take care of herself and trying to decide for herself what to best do for herself in her life. And there we come to the end of a year. It's what we call today the holiday time, where you have Thanksgiving, followed by Christmas, followed by New Year. And it's in this environment that she's invited to attend a party between Christmas and New Year where there was going to be a dance. And it's there at that particular party, this young gal meets this young guy who happens to be a Marine. Now, let me tell you about this particular guy. He was from West Virginia, and he had been in the Navy, and then he actually joined the Marines, and he was beginning to finish out his last tour, and he was doing security out at 29 Palms, which is a massive complex. But he also worked part-time at the gas station that was run by this gal's older brother. And that's how the two of them are introduced. This young gal, all of 17 years of age, meets this guy a few years older, a handsome guy, and falls head over heels for him at that dance. And she is determined beyond determined can be to get this guy to marry him, if it's the last thing she ever does. And so a couple of months later, she convinces him to head off to Southern California for a weekend. And there they tell everybody that they're married, which they weren't, and they spent several days just north of Los Angeles at a place that is known as Paradise Cove. When she and him come back, he is then sent away for a while on maneuvers for a few months, which was not uncommon. He was going to be gone for a short amount of time, and it was during that time she realized she was pregnant. And when she let her brother know what had happened, her brother was furious. and forbid her to ever make contact with this young Marine, that he should never know what happened. In fact, her brother then put her on a train and sent her back to her dad in New York City. And that's where she ended up, back home in New York City. And there, very much showing and very much pregnant. We are now in the summer of 1954.
Lately when I'm in my room, all by myself, in the solitary gloom, I call to myself. Hey there, you with the stars in your eyes, love never made a fool of you. You used to be too wise. Hey there, you on that high-flying cloud, though he won't throw a crumb to you, you think someday he'll come to you. Better forget him with his nose in the air. He has you dancing on a string. Break it and he won't care. Won't you take this advice I hand you like a mother? Or are you not seeing things too clear? Are you too much in love to hear? Is it all going in one ear and out the other? Hey there, you with the stars in your eyes.
Are you talking to me?
Love never made a fool of you.
Not until now.
You used to be too wise.
Yes, I was once.
Will you take this advice I hand you like a mother? Or am I not seeing things too clear? Are you just too far gone to hear? Is it all going in one ear and out the other?
From the summer of 1954, that is Rosemary Clooney and Hey There. That young gal would have probably known that song as it was very popular. And now she finds herself in the summer of 1954 back in Brooklyn. Now things have changed since she had left. In fact, her dad and this woman he had married were now separated, and he was getting a divorce. And so she's living with her dad. But understand the time and the place and the era that she's now living. Today, women that are pregnant out of wedlock, it's very commonplace. No one even thinks twice about it anymore. But way back in 1954, it was very much different. People didn't want to associate with somebody who was pregnant and unmarried. Her dad didn't even know what to think or what she should even do. And it's in this backdrop, probably around August, early part of August, that she is sitting outside for a little while on the front step of their brownstone, contemplating what her future is going to be, if anything. She knows she has this child coming in just a couple of months, and she's scared, doesn't know what to do. And this young gal happens to come down the street and just walks up her step and asks this gal, who looks so despondent sitting up there on these steps, what's wrong? And they open up a conversation, probably the first real friend this young gal has had in quite a while. And this young gal made it very clear that she'd be delighted to be her friend and even help her through this process. And in a matter of days, in a matter of just a few days, this gal moved in to the house and started taking care of this very scared and terrified 18-year-old with a child. An 18-year-old, almost 19, not knowing what life would bring. And for the next month or so, this new friend, who had just literally moved in, took good care of this woman, made sure that she ate well, made sure that she got plenty of rest, made sure she even visited the health department to check on things. And then when we got to the time of delivery, a storm happened to come up, and they all rode together in a taxi cab to the hospital. And there she gave birth to a young baby boy. And they went home a day or so later, and there she and her friend are doing their best to take care of this very young child. And it's in this backdrop, again, this is a true story. She happened to ask this gal, did you ever go to church? And she said, years ago I did, and matter of fact, I used to go to this Lutheran church as a child just around the corner from where we live. And she said, do you plan on having this young boy baptized? And she said, I don't know. I hadn't even really thought about it. And she insisted this boy be dedicated and baptized, and that she would go with her to talk to the pastor of that church, even though she hadn't been there in a long time, to get the child baptized. And so they went. And this pastor normally didn't do what they call outside baptisms. In other words, people from outside of the church or people that hadn't been involved in the church. He was pretty stern about that. But for her, he made an exception, and they set a date and a time on a Sunday afternoon after church early in the month of December. And there, this young gal, along with her friend and her dad and an aunt, came to this church on that Sunday afternoon and gathered around this beautiful, very large marble baptismal font. Now, what made this baptismal font so unique, there was a large carving of a sailing vessel, the type that many of the Norwegians and Swedes came to New York upon a generation or so before. And how many young children of Scandinavian descent had been baptized at that church in its history. And there on that Sunday, that child was baptized and set apart. From here, the story takes a bit of a twist and a turn. I want to stop just for a moment to remind you, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Your Weekend Show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. And I'm taking some time today on this program to share a very true story with you that occurred a number of years ago. If you're just tuning in, we finished up this last segment about this young newborn baby being baptized at a Lutheran church in Brooklyn, New York, and how this young unwed mother and a new friend of hers who actually moved in to help her through this process was there witnessing that baptism that day. And there in December of 1954, they left that church and went back home. And then a couple of days later, this young gal, by the way, this person that went to spend time with this woman, her name was Lee. That's what she told this young mother. Her name was Lee, and she moved in and helped this young, unmarried, pregnant gal through a very difficult time, through the end of her pregnancy, through delivery, and through the baptism of her child. And it was shortly after that that Lee announced to this young mother, whose name was Arlene. Lee said to Arlene, "My time has come. It's time for me to leave." And a day or so later, she packed her few belongings and left, and the two of them never saw each other again. The next several months were a very difficult time for Arlene, this unwed mother with this young boy. She was constantly being pursued to give up the child for adoption. Her dad had mixed emotions about the young boy in their home. While he cared deeply, he didn't know what to do. And so Arlene headed to upstate New York to try to build a life for herself as a telephone operator in Rome, New York, and that didn't pan out. She worked as a waitress. That never quite panned out. And she eventually ended up back in Brooklyn, New York with her dad, trying to figure a way to restart her life. And it's in those circumstances, as we approach Christmas of 1955, that she makes the most difficult decision of her life to let this young baby be placed for adoption. And she surrenders this young boy to the state of New York with all the paperwork she had. And it's in that paperwork process that the state discovers that because this young boy had been baptized Lutheran, they were obligated to find a Lutheran family, and they contacted Lutheran Social Services of New York to have them place the child. This child could have gone anywhere in the city of New York, but instead this child left the city of New York and ended up with a family in Long Island. All of this happened decades ago. All of this is a true story. And it's amazing what this one act of baptism at the Salem Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church in Brooklyn, New York did to alter and set a pathway for that young child. Now, if you haven't guessed by now, that young child was me. I was the one born in October of 1954, 65 years ago this past week. And when I was born, I was given the name Robert and the middle name Lee, L-E-E, because that was the name of the gal that was there to befriend and help and care for my mother, Arlene, who placed me for adoption in December of 1955 at Christmas time. And I was sent to a family in early 1955 that lived in Manhasset, Long Island, way outside of New York City. And only because of the merits of that baptism did I end up where I did. I could have ended up in any household, anywhere, and most probably within the city of New York and not being sent outside the city to the suburban areas of Long Island. What a difference that day in December, the baptism made in the trajectory of my life. And I look back at it now, and the life that I was given compared to the life that I would have had. And the word blessing does not even begin to describe the life that I was given moving forward. This is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. Once again, the website, yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. We're going to take a little break, and I'm going to finish this story and give you the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. You want to stay tuned for the next chapter of this story. We'll be right back.
On the air and online at yourweekendshow.com with Bob Biermann.
In today's world, sharing the gospel is getting harder and harder. Being able to learn God's word to be able to minister or share the good news is also becoming more difficult. If you know you have a call on your life and are seeking to get the needed education and preparation for ministry, why not look into the Trinity Graduate School and Seminary? Trinity Graduate School and Seminary exists to glorify Jesus Christ as Lord by preparing adults to evangelize, disciple, and minister to the world. Since 1973, Trinity Graduate School and Seminary has fulfilled its mission of preparing men and women for ministry. Trinity Graduate School and Seminary is accessible to students around the world through an online delivery system. To find out more information, why not visit their website at trinitygraduate.com. That's trinitygraduate.com.
Who is it? It's your weekend show with Bob Biermann.
He's a radio announcer.
Ooh.
And welcome back to your weekend show. In just a couple of seconds, I'm going to share the rest of this story I've been telling you. If you've been following the entire program, I've been sharing a story with you about my biological mother, who was born in Brooklyn, New York, and had a very difficult childhood, and the circumstances of how I came along and ended up being put up for adoption. And I want to pick up a couple of things on this story. If you were listening, you now know that I had been placed for adoption around 1 year of age into a very loving and Christian family in Long Island in Manhasset, New York. And my family made sure that we were actively involved in a church setting. And I was adopted into a home that already had an adopted brother there, about 1.5 years older than I am. And later we even added a sister. None of us are blood related, but we were raised as brothers and sisters, and we still treat each other that way to this day. We were given the opportunity of being able to go to a good church, but also a parochial school. I was in parochial school from kindergarten through the 8th grade, and had our family not decided to move to a small town in way upstate New York, I probably, most likely, would have gone on to Lutheran High School in Brookville, New York, which is also in Long Island. So I was given a wonderful foundation, and as I mentioned before, all because of that baptism. All because of that, I was placed in the home and environment in which I lived. And I went on in life to, as many of you know, a radio announcer, went back to college, ended up in the ministry later in life. But along the way in the 1980s, when I was well into my 30s and married, my wife at the time, who has since passed away back in 2004, she asked me the question, what do you know about your biology? I mean, we know your adoptive family, and you've always been comfortable with that, and truthfully, I very much was comfortable in the identity of being Robert Biermann, not Robert Lee Erickson. I knew that as my birth name. I was very happy being who I was. But my wife said, you need to know more about who you are, because you never know as you get older what kind of health issues you may be needing to anticipate. And so I thought about it for quite a while. And this is long before the internet, long before any of that kind of stuff, and I didn't really want to offend my family, but I decided to do what I could to find out who I was and where I came from, and anything that I needed to know about myself that would be important moving forward. And so, long before Google, long before any of it, I started doing some research and making phone calls around Brooklyn, New York. Well, I got nowhere in that. I couldn't find anybody or anything in any phone book that I was able to acquire from Brooklyn to help me at all. And so I was kind of ready to give up just a little bit because I couldn't figure out anything. So I decided to visit, because I had an altered copy of my baptismal certificate. That's all I had. And I decided to visit the church in Brooklyn, New York, on a visit to Long Island to visit my grandparents. I took a side trip to that church, and I was able to get a copy of my original baptismal certificate that gave me my mother's full name, her dad or my grandfather's full name, even the father's full name, though he was never aware of my circumstance, and other names and some identifying information. And with that material, then I petitioned the state of New York to give me the, quote, non-identifying information. And that's how I started putting all the pieces together. And over a 3-year period of time, I had a good understanding of my background and who I was and where I came from, and the story I just shared about the circumstances of my birth and where I had been and where my mother had been and how she ended up in California and then New York, and now where had she gone in life. And I paid a service to do one of those searches to see if they could figure out anything about her after the time that I was adopted. And it took a lot of months and a lot of money. But one day I get a phone call that they have the report and they have all the information, and they actually know my mother's name now, what had become of her, and where she was currently living. But they didn't have a phone number. And to make a long story short, I did a little bit of detective work when I found out the name of the place she lived, and I was able to figure out who her neighbor was. And this is long before the internet. And I made a very fateful phone call to Reseda, California. At the time, I was living in Toccoa, Georgia. That's where I ended up for a number of years, working at that time for Toccoa Falls College. And I got a hold of this lady who happened to live in the apartment across from my mother's. And when I told her the basic circumstances, she stopped me and said, "You must be Robert, the son that she gave up for adoption. She has talked about that a number of times in her life. Let me go across the street and tell her what's happening." And 5 minutes later, I was on the phone with my biological mother. I'm now 35 years of age, 36? And a week later, I was on an airliner flying out to Reseda, California, to meet Arlene Erickson, who is now Arlene Demzina, and found out a lot about my circumstances, and also learned that after she had left New York, she had actually joined the United States Army for a couple of years, met a guy that was finishing up his Army career. They married and settled in, ready for this, Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. Now, the reason it's kind of a startling thing to me, by the way, she had a son and a daughter, a son named Tom. His middle name became Robert, and a daughter named Jean. Now, what is so strange about Cuyahoga Falls, if you've ever heard me talk about what I did after high school, I went to an electronics school in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. And in fact, I learned later, after we had met, and as I've looked at maps since, that I lived basically around the corner from where she was living. And about the time that I moved to Cuyahoga Falls, she and my younger brother and my much younger sister moved to California. We crossed paths almost in 1972. And here I am now meeting and learning about a half-brother and a half-sister and a whole nother world and family. And as exciting as it was, as I thought years later, my mother has since passed away, as I thought years later, as much as my mother, my biological mother, is a wonderful person, how blessed I was to be raised the way that I was, and where I was, and how I was, that being set apart in the way that I was at that baptism in that church many years ago, and how fortunate I also learned later in life in meeting her. She was excited to meet me, but I learned something. Had I been born 20 years later, I wouldn't have been born. Because, see, 20 years after my time, abortion was legal in the United States, and that was an option she had seriously considered. Basically, I wouldn't be here had I been born or had I come along 20 years later. My half-sister had a very difficult time with men, went through a number of abortions which she dearly regretted in her later years. It left scars on her mentally and emotionally. And sadly, she died of cancer several years ago. It's something that's primarily on her father's side. My half-brother and I get along quite nicely. In fact, I moved him from California to be near me. He had a number of health issues, and I've helped care for him and get him established in his life. And he does very well for himself these days. One of the things that has always troubled me since the 1970s, when abortion became legal in the United States, knowing that I was adopted, I always wondered long before I met my mother, would I even be here had abortion been legal? And this life that I have experienced, this life that I have had, I wouldn't trade it in for anything in the world. This life that I've been given, even in spite of the difficulties and the challenges and the hard times that I've faced, I'm still in amazement of what life can truly be. Here, 65 years later. 65 with a Medicare card. on Social Security and other retirement income, which allows me the time to do a radio show like this and help and serve churches and other people in their needs. And I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here. And sadly, in these roughly 45, 46 years since Roe v. Wade came through the Supreme Court, and millions upon millions never made it to term, I have to wonder, how has that impacted us as a society? Has life become cheaper? I think that it has for many people. Have we become better people? No, we have not. If anything, we have become more narcissistic. As we've talked about before, it's all about me and what I want, and nothing, not even another human being, gets in our way. We are looking for the expedient in this world today. Let's be honest about it. We are looking for what is expedient. If you go back to ancient times, and this is what I want to talk about for a few minutes before the program ends. There were some ancient religions, and there are some similarities to a number of these ancient religions, no matter where you found them, whether in the Middle East or even South America. In the Bible, we are told about a religion that the children of Israel are forbidden to get anywhere near, and that is the worship of a god called Moloch. Moloch, this ancient deity. And you see it in other cultures as well. This is a god. Oftentimes in the ancient days, they would create this large idol. And if you were looking for prosperity and happiness in your life, all you had to do was sacrifice and kill your firstborn infant to Moloch, and you would be given prosperity, fertility, and happiness. And in the ancient regions of Persia where this god lived, there was a large metal and stone idol built, and they would set fire inside of this idol to get it glowing red hot. And there were these arms to hold an infant, and they would put this infant child just barely from birth into the arms to burn. And they would sing and dance around this thing to drown out the sound of the infant's screams. Today in abortion, the screams are silent. Today in abortion, we don't see the suffering and the pain. The Bible says, I knew you in the womb. You weren't some kind of just tissue. You weren't some kind of just little zygote. You weren't some kind of non-living thing. You were known and alive before Almighty God in the womb. And we have built a culture that has no value on life. Our convenience and what we want for ourselves is more important. And we're willing to kill a child in the womb for our own benefit. We are literally falling victim and listening to the ancient demonic spirit of a god that never went away, called Moloch. In essence, the entire abortion culture is worshiping Moloch because he will give you prosperity in exchange for killing your child. And we have been so blinded, and we have been so deceived. That's why the children of Israel were forbidden to even associate with those that worship Moloch, because God abhorred and despised the concept of children's sacrifice, because it was wrong. It is forbidden. If you look at the writings of the ancient church, abortion is spoken about quite often as being forbidden and being condemned. They had ways they would attempt to do it, even in those times. God values the life that He places in you. God values the life He places in all of His creation. And that includes those that are conceived. I stand angry at times at some church bodies that have now embraced abortion as okay. It isn't. And if your church does, it's an apostate church. Leave, run, get away. Because the day of God's judgment is coming. For me, I live for the work that I do now for His kingdom. I am thankful for the life that I was given. I'm so happy that I was born at the time that I was. For now I can live for Christ alone. This is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann.
In Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace, when fears are stilled, when striving cease. My comforter, my all in all, here in the love of Christ I stand. In Christ alone, who took on flesh, fullness of God in helpless babe. This gift of love and righteousness is borne by the ones He came to save. Till on that cross as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied. For every sin on whom was laid, here in the death of Christ I live.
need to tell you right now, this was one of the hardest Your Weekend shows I've ever done, because not so much sharing my life story with you. I'm more than happy to do that. I'm happy to share my life with you. And I hope and I pray each time that I do, when I do this program, that maybe it's changed your perspective. Maybe it's been a great help to you in your walk, in your journey in this life. That's why we do Your Weekend show. What makes this program so hard is to have to recognize where our world has gone in the 65 years since I arrived on this planet and have lived my time on this earth. I have been blessed to see so many wonderful things happen in technology, but I watch our society rot and decay from the inside out and fall for nothing more than recycled paganism and Moloch worship. It breaks my heart. I want to thank you for taking the time you did to listen to this program today. And I really hope and pray that for some of you, you found hope and maybe find redemption, because no matter what you've done in this life, there is hope and redemption available to you. Reach out to the loving hand of our Savior Jesus Christ, and you too can have hope in Christ alone. Don't forget the website, yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. Would you take the time to let me know that you listened to the program today? It would mean the world to me. Go to yourweekendshow.com, send me an email. I would love to hear from you. Until next week at this same time, may God richly bless you, is my prayer.
On the air and online at yourweekendshow.com.